And thank you, Anne, for the invitation to be part of this. When Anne Simon contacted me about this series of journées, Proust, la pensée, l'émotion, l'écriture, I began quite excitedly to think about these topics and the lie of the critical land in relation to them. Anne herself has contributed enormously to our understanding of Proust and modern thought, and thought in Proust. It's already 10 years since Inge Crossman-Wimmers published her monograph on Proust and emotion. These works that I'm mentioning are listed at the foot of the handout for your reference. So Proust and emotion was 2003. More recently, Katja Haustein has published a thought-provoking article on what she calls Proust's emotional cavities, relating affect and the visual in the Recherches. And writing, the narrator's ultimate goal in the novel, has preoccupied readers from the earliest commentators to the most recent critics, such as Martin Hagland, whose philosophically nuanced study, Dying for Time, explores Proustian metaphysics and frames the protagonist's wish to write, not as a desire for immortality, but one for survival. He makes a distinction between those two. These recent works of criticism, and many others besides, have broached and illuminated aspects of thought, emotion, and writing in Proust. Given the extraordinary riches of Proust's novel, it seemed to me, ever optimistic or foolhardy perhaps, that it should not be too hard to light upon an aspect of the Recherche that permitted a reflection on all of these things together. La pensée, l'émotion, l'écriture. For my part, since my early interest in reading in Proust, I've wanted to write something on the latent or not so latent letter novel that subtends the great overarching structure of À la Recherche. And as I thought about la pensée, l'émotion, l'écriture, gradually I realized perhaps this was my opportunity and a chance to work on some of the material that I didn't include in my book about reading in À la Recherche. The novel is studded with written correspondence. As Alain Vuisine puts it, it is saturé de lettres, billets, télégrammes, petits bleus. In the very early pages of Combray, the hero experiences his first drama of anticipation and disappointment when he writes his mother a note, begging her to come to his side. It goes unanswered, or rather, the response delivered by Françoise to the trembling child narrator, sans ménagement pour mon amour propre, he says, is crushing in its simplicity. Il n'y a pas de réponse. And this in many ways is a foundational scene for the narrator, a model of things to come. But the narrator is far from having a monopoly on the novel's correspondence. Swann receives missives from Odette and intercepts a letter from her intended for his rival Forcheville. Later, an anonymous letter about Odette's alleged infidelities stokes the fires of Swann's jealousy. The protagonist himself waits for letters from Gilberte and receives a love note, a billet doux from Albertine on the cliffside near Balbec. Charlus is a writer of letters and a recipient of one, as we've just seen with the mystery letter from Pierre. And the narrator's grandmother and mother are devotees of the letters of Madame de Sévigny. One telegram announces Albertine's death, another resurrects her momentarily in Albertine disparue. The Recherches' last letters from the adult Gilberte bring news of her marriage and of the evolving theatre of war around Combray. And the protagonist's return to the social world after his seclusion in various maisons de santé is prompted by the receipt of a carte d'invitation for a matinée taking place the following day at the home of the Prince de Guermantes. Besides these structurally significant letters, one might also examine a secondary grouping of letters from minor characters that serve, among other things, as miniature studies in sociolinguistics. It's funny that I wrote that sentence before hearing Eddie's paper. It's a lot of which we've just heard. Such as, and this is another one for Eddie's set, the Vallée de Pieds letter to his cousin, which is reproduced, spelling mistakes and all, in Le Côté de Guermantes, as well as the reports from Aimé as he searches in the Touraine for the fugitive Albertine. All of the novel's correspondence, the letters, notes, and telegrams, feeds its extraordinary hermeneutic appetite. The writing and sending of letters, their anticipation and receipt, are activities fueled by desirous energies and fraught with anxiety and uncertainty. It's on the writing, sending, and receiving of letters that I will focus today, since these activities, under close examination, reveal themselves to be a vitally important nexus in the novel of la pensée, l'émotion, and l'écriture. These terms themselves often cropping up under the narrator's pen as he offers his accounts of what I'm calling, because of the irresistible echo, some of the novel's lettres de fuite. I'm going to consider a number of scenes then in which the writing and sending of letters is prompted by the breakup or threatened rupture of an amorous relationship. The sending of missives, as explored famously by Derrida in La Carte Postale, is an activity bound up with attitudes to communication, otherness, and futurity. These matters, the emotions they provoke, and the epistemological schemes the protagonist develops to deal with them will be at the heart of what follows. The first scene I'm going to consider is in the opening section of À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleurs. The protagonist's visit has deprived Gilberte of her dance class. The atmosphere is frosty. Talk is of the weather, the ticking of the clock. Gilberte's frustration is evident, and when she laughs at the narrator's comment that she is pas gentille, his subsequent reflections launch us directly into the crux of their failing relationship. This is your first quotation on the handout. Je sentis ce qu'il y avait de douloureux pour moi à ne pouvoir atteindre cet autre plan, plus insaisissable de sa pensée que décrivait sans rire. Immediately, thought and emotion are yoked together here. The inscrutable, inaccessible thought processes veiled by the dismissive laugh provoke discomfort and pain for the narrator, and soon his mind is made up. He will renounce his relationship with Gilberte. This decision, however, brings with it untold chagrin that the narrator dissects in the passage that follows, this is quotation 2. Un tel chagrin, caused by the separation from someone who was previously the source of our happiness, the narrator writes, détermine en nous une tempête furieuse contre laquelle nous ne savons pas si nous serons capables de lutter jusqu'au bout. Celle qui soufflait sur mon cœur était si violente que je revins vers la maison, bousculé, meurtri, sentant que je ne pourrais retrouver la respiration qu'en rebroussant chemin, qu'en retournant sous un prétexte quelconque auprès de Gilberte. Mais elle se serait dit « Encore lui, décidément je peux tout me permettre. Il reviendra chaque fois d'autant plus docile qu'il m'aura quitté plus malheureux. » Puis j'étais irrésistiblement ramené vers elle par ma pensée et ses orientations alternatives. Cet affolement de la boussole intérieure persistèrent quand je fus rentré et se traduisirent par les bruyants de lettres contradictoires que j'écrivis à Gilberte. I think the phrase in that closing sentence, cet affolement de la boussole intérieure, is an excellent shorthand for the emotional impact of the scenes of rupture that I'm interested in. It's just how one might sum up, in fact, the impact of reading the series of telegrams relating to Albertine's death that I've mentioned just now. But what complicates matters here is that this destabilizing blow does not stem from an act of revelatory reading. It stems from a personal interaction and leads to an act of writing. The narrator despaired at the inaccessibility of Gilberte's thought processes. Now his own thought pulls him in conflicting directions and leads to the writing of lettres contradictoires. He tells us that the letter he ends up writing is one in which he gives vent to his rage. It's quotation number 3. But characteristically, this is not all. Je venais d'écrire à Gilberte une lettre où je laissais tonner ma fureur, non sans pourtant jeter la bouée de quelques mots placés comme au hasard et où mon ami pourrait accrocher une réconciliation. Un instant après, le vent ayant tourné, c'étaient des phrases tendres que je lui adressais pour la douceur de certaines expressions désolées, de telles jamais plus, si attendrissants pour ceux qui les emploient, si fastidieux pour celle qui les lira. Soit qu'elle les croit mensongers et traduise jamais plus par ce soir même, si vous voulez bien de moi, ou qu'elle les croit vraies et lui annonçant alors une de ces séparations définitives qui nous sont si parfaitement égales dans la vie quand il s'agit d'êtres dont nous ne sommes pas épris. Mais puisque nous sommes incapables, tandis que nous aimons, d'agir en dignes prédécesseurs de l'être prochain que nous serons et qui n'aimera plus, comment pourrions-nous tout à fait imaginer l'état d'esprit d'une femme à qui, même si nous savions que nous lui sommes indifférents, nous avons perpétuellement fait tenir dans nos rêveries pour nous bercer d'un beau songe ou nous consoler d'un gros chagrin, les mêmes propos que si elle nous aimait. These reflections offer one of the earliest acknowledgements in the novel of the plurality of the self and prepare the ground for the narrator's later experiences of loss when he suffers the deaths of his grandmother and of Albertine. As the paragraph unfolds, the narrator goes on to articulate a stance with regard to the female mind that is reminiscent, I think, of Freud's notorious remark made in The Question of Lay Analysis that the sexual life of adult women is a dark continent for psychology. Proust's narrator writes, this is quotation 4, that devant les pensées et les actions d'une femme que nous aimons, nous sommes aussi désorientés que le pouvaient être devant les phénomènes de la nature les premiers physiciens, avant que la science fût constituée et eût mis un peu de lumière dans l'inconnu. Ou puis encore, comme un être pour l'esprit de qui le principe de causalité existerait à peine, un être qui ne serait pas capable d'établir un lien entre un phénomène et un autre, et devant qui le spectacle du monde serait incertain comme un rêve. We can see, I think, from these startling lines, a continuation of the initial image of the upset compass in the notion of being here désorienté. Notice too how quickly the narrator switches from the lucid presentation of his own rapidly shifting thought processes to his picture of total incomprehension before those of the object of his affections. The portrait of the mind in process here that emerges is intriguing. Merely the idea that a breakup may not be necessary and that a resolution is possible, the narrator argues, develops comme une graine vivace les linéaments, tout le détail des émotions qui naîtraient de l'acte exécuté. And so the pendulum swings continue back and forth until ultimately the narrator determines to keep his distance and to await a letter rather than to send one. Gilberte will start to miss him and re-establish contact, he hopes, but thus places himself in the anxiety-riven, future-oriented position of the mailbox watcher. Le courrier du matin, he tells us, fut attendu par moi chaque jour avec les palpitations de cœur auxquelles succédait un état d'abattement quand je n'y avais trouvé que des lettres de personnes qui n'étaient pas Gilberte, ou bien rien, ce qui n'était pas pire, les preuves d'amitié d'une autre me rendant plus cruelle celle de son indifférence. Notice how the physical symptoms of the relation's rupture, breathlessness and feeling bousculé, meurtri in the second quotation on the handout, return here amplified via the emotional charge of the hope that the relationship might be rekindled. The anticipated rupture created shortness of breath. Anticipated reunion provokes palpitations and abattement. This emotionally charged act of waiting is another anticipation within the longue durée of the novel. Later on, the narrator will keenly await the daily delivery of Le Figaro to see if his article has been published. And fraught with uncertainty, he will, in Albertine Disparue, await the letters of Saint-Loup, telegrams from Aimé, and above all, missives from the fugitive Albertine. In the scene in hand, he does not know whether Gilberte will write to him or not. Rather than simply accepting his suffering, he perpetually entertains the possibility that it might come to an end. That's quotation 5. J'étais obligé, pour ainsi dire, de la renouveler, cette souffrance, de la renouveler sans cesse. Le chagrin était peut-être le même, mais au lieu de ne faire, comme autrefois, que prolonger uniformément une émotion initiale, recommencer plusieurs fois par jour, en débutant par une émotion si fréquemment renouvelée qu'elle finissait, elle, état tout physique, si momentané, par se stabiliser, si bien que les troubles causés par l'attente, ayant à peine le temps de se calmer, avant qu'une nouvelle raison d'attendre survint, il n'y avait plus une seule minute par jour où je ne fusse dans cette anxiété qu'il est pourtant si difficile de supporter pendant une heure. This intriguing nested sentence is an intense exercise in the study of cause and effect, and thus directly in tension with the earlier image of the male lover contemplating his female companion's thought processes being comme un être pour l'esprit de qui le principe de causalité existerait à peine, etc. The narrator here lays out with scientific precision the workings of his own mind that are triggered by his bafflement before the mind of Gilberte. An early illustration, we might say, of the axiom prompted by Albertine's departure that l'homme est l'être qui ne peut sortir de soi, qui ne connaît les autres qu'en soi, et en disant le contraire, ment. Now, returning to the passage in hand, that's quotation 5, j'étais obligé pour ainsi dire, etc. It's important, I think, to underline how early in the novel these lines appear. We're in À l'ombre des jeunes filles here, yet read in isolation, I think given the syntax and the tone and the lexis, we could quite easily mistake them for a passage of accounting for the narrator's emotional state in Albertine disparue. And it's to that part of the novel that I want to turn in my closing section. The lexical field of souffrance and chagrin grows lush and abundant in the Albertine cycle. These two tightly knit volumes, La Prisonnière and Albertine disparue, representing an anatomy of jealousy that morphs into an anatomy of grief. In relation to jealousy, Jean-Yves Tadier has recently suggested that these volumes can be read as le paroxysme de cette maladie, jealousy. Grief, loss, and mourning have been impressively illuminated by two recent doctoral theses by Anna Elsner and Jenny Rushworth, both ici présentes. For our purposes today, one might add that these two volumes, La Prisonnière and Albertine disparue, are arguably the locus of the novel's most insightful and provocative sustained engagement with thought and emotion, la pensée et l'émotion. The area on which I will focus is the aftermath of Albertine's departure and the impact of her lettre de fuite, the letter that she leaves behind. This letter explains in her words that entre nous, la vie est devenue impossible, and that her decision to leave the narrator is irrévocable. The letter is quoted in full in the text, and his initial reaction is one of blinkered refusal. Tout cela ne signifie rien, me dis-je. C'est même meilleur que je ne pensais, car comme elle ne pense rien de tout cela, elle ne l'a évidemment écrit que pour frapper un grand coup, afin que je prenne peur. The emotion that the letter prompts, though, isn't so much fear as anxiety, and with that, pain. In the immediate aftermath of reading the letter, the narrator is thrown into a maelstrom of hypotheses and imagined scenarios about Albertine's departure and her possible return. Gradually, however, the material traces left behind, the letter and her rings discovered in a drawer by Françoise, become hermeneutic objects whose sense has a powerfully destabilizing effect on the narrator. Peter Collier was the first to write about these in his book Proust in Venice, which still is very revealing about this scene. There's a destabilizing effect of returning to these texts, the rings and the letter. And it's the rereading that somehow hits him harder. It's quotation number 6. Relire ma décision est irrévocable, c'était autre chose. C'était comprendre un médicament dangereux qui m'eût donné une crise cardiaque à laquelle on peut ne pas survivre. Il y a dans les choses, dans les événements, dans les lettres de rupture, un péril particulier qui amplifie et dénature la douleur même que les êtres peuvent nous causer. You notice here that there's a very similar structure here. The médicament, which can bring about a health problem which we might not survive. It's very similar to quotation number 2, that the storm that we might not be capable of holding out against. The letter of rupture then has a sort of multiplier effect on the physical and emotional state of the narrator. Things, as so often in Proust, get more complicated, however, when a telegram arrives from Albertine, which has already been mentioned a couple of times today. In fact, no, this is a different telegram, sorry. The telegram from Albertine this time is complaining about his tactic of sending Saint-Loup after her to Touraine. Again, it's quoted in full in the text. Si vous aviez besoin de moi, pourquoi ne pas m'avoir écrit directement? She writes. J'aurais été trop heureuse de revenir. Now, this phrase obviously is in direct contradiction with the irrevocableness of her decision uttered in the previous letter. But this sentence, j'aurais été trop heureuse de revenir, pitches the narrator into a new access of optimism. Comme nous allons être heureux, he says to himself. A wonderful moment. Like, no, you're not. Comme nous allons être heureux, he says to himself. But soon, with an act of rereading again, he comes back down to earth. And forgive me for a last long quotation, but I really think that this is a single paragraph that stands alone, quotation number 7. It's 25 lines of Pléiade text, and I think in this we've got an awful lot of the kind of core business, to use a horrible kind of management speak term, of emotion and writing and thought in Proust. So there we are, it's the last one. Cependant, Je relisais sa lettre et j'étais tout de même déçu du peu qu'il y a d'une personne dans une lettre. Sans doute, les caractères tracés expriment notre pensée, ce que font aussi nos traits. C'est toujours en présence d'une pensée que nous nous trouvons. Mais tout de même, dans la personne, la pensée ne nous apparaît qu'après s'être diffusée dans cette corolle du visage épanoui comme un nymphéa. Cela la modifie tout de même beaucoup. Et c'est peut-être une des causes de nos perpétuelles déceptions en amour que ces perpétuelles déviations qu'à l'attente de l'être idéal que nous aimons, chaque rendez-vous nous apporte en réponse une personne de chair qui tient déjà si peu de notre rêve. Et puis, quand nous réclamons quelque chose de cette personne, nous recevons d'elle une lettre ou même de la personne, il reste très peu. Comme dans les lettres de l'algèbre, il ne reste plus la détermination des chiffres que de l'arithmétique, lesquels déjà ne contiennent plus les qualités des fruits ou des fleurs additionnées. Et pourtant, amour, être aimé, ces lettres, c'est peut-être tout de même des traductions, si insatisfaisant qu'il soit de passer de l'un à l'autre de la même réalité, puisque la lettre ne nous semble insuffisante qu'en la lisant, mais que nous suons morts et patients tant qu'elle n'arrive pas, et qu'elle suffit à calmer notre angoisse, sinon à remplir avec ces petits signes noirs notre désir qui sent qu'il n'y a là tout de même que l'équivalence d'une parole, d'un sourire, d'un baiser, non, ces choses mêmes. This passage, I think, resembles a sort of tentative pondering of, we might say, Derridian supplementarity avant la lettre. Proust complicates matters here in a number of ways. The comments are hedged about by no fewer than 5 uses of that concessive tout de même. He suggests that between each of us and the thoughts our beloved may communicate to us in a letter, there are a number of filters. His or her thought isn't only transformed by the language chosen for the task, but also by the mental image of their appearance, their face that we carry around with us. Now here I have a brief digression. It seems to me that this unusual image of the nénuphar might be a moment of Proust unavowedly approaching the cubist aesthetic of his time. The spiky imbricated first slide, the spiky imbricated corolla of the flower, here introduced in relation to the face, puts me in mind of Picasso's well-known 1915 portrait of the art dealer Ambroise Vollard, whose face is splintered and overlaid on the canvas. This is just a passing observation, but it's striking, I think, in particular, given the nénuphar's usual association with Impressionist aesthetics, that this spikiness and separation, and I put them together there, can make your own minds up. It's not a vital part of what I'm saying here, but I think when we find an unusual image in the midst of a text like this, it's worth giving some thought to. Fin de la digression. So back to the passage. If we go looking for traces of our beloved in a letter, we may as well be deciphering an algebraic equation, something which, under normal circumstances, is usually devoid of emotional investment. Yet time and again, the novel shows us scenes of awaiting correspondence that are freighted with significant emotional charge. And this is because of the vital realization that comes at the close of the paragraph. A letter, when actually read, amounts to almost nothing. Ces petits signes noirs. Yet as long as it remains virtual, which is to say, as yet unopened or even unsent, it has an extraordinary power over our minds and our emotions. And if the insights of this paragraph seem particularly convincing or particularly profound, it's in part because they corroborate the scene with which I began from À l'ombre des jeunes filles, and they find echoes in many of the novel's other scenes relating to the reading of amorous correspondence. It's interesting too, to conclude then, that in both scenes the verb traduire crops up. First in the relatively narrow context of writing a letter of rupture, second in the context of reading one, but also more broadly in a consideration of the perilous range of interpretive activities that we call love. The figure of translation will of course assume primary importance in Le Temps retrouvé, when the narrator finally recognizes his vocation as a writer whose undertakings are, he realizes, ceux d'un traducteur. There are long-standing debates about how we read that particular section of the novel. specifically with regard to whether the book we have just read is the book the narrator protagonist is readying himself to write. My view is that we do not know what that book is, since within the admittedly complex chronology of Le Temps retrouvé, of that closing section, the book remains to be written. Or to put it differently, it remains virtual, as yet not knowingly broached by writer or reader. And this is one of the reasons why reading à la recherche, I think, is so enduringly engaging. If the novel the narrator will write is a sort of letter he sends to his readers, for the duration of à la recherche, it does not arrive. It is a lettre en souffrance. And just like the protagonist in the last quotation on your handout, nous suons morts et patients tant qu'elle n'arrive pas. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a paper which admirably broaches new ground, but also links with the previous paper from Eddie Hughes and resonates with other things we've already heard today, and is adding to the texture of our day. So thank you very much. Does somebody have a question that they are ready to?
Thank you. Your paper, thank you for your paper, which actually made me think of a question that I had for Eddie as well, sort of for both of you. Perhaps because I'm a Flaubertian at heart, but I kept thinking of Flaubert and the citationary practice of these pastiching either sociologically different pieces of writing or pieces of writing from other people. And in Flaubert's case, one always gets a feeling that there's a distanciation, a sort of I'm somehow better than you. And I wondered whether that isn't true in Proust's case as well, in which case the novel would be less a letter, like the other letters, than something that goes far beyond a letter. Is it not an instance, the novel that we're reading, of language that has got beyond the level of the letter? Or are we to read in a more humble light? Is Proust projecting his work in a more humble light than that?
Yeah, I think it's much more than a letter. Yeah, I mean, and I think that just as there are multiple levels and kind of archaeological strata that we can delve into, there are also multiple addressees. I think that a letter generally is addressed to a single individual. And I think that à la recherche it goes so far and into so many corners that we can't. It was a handy way to tie the paper up at the end, I suppose, to call it a letter. But actually, there's a more serious point that the Alain Buizin's book on Proust et ses lettres, he sees à la recherche as a letter from Proust to his mother, and he seems really to believe that this is about kind of coming to grips with the maternal relationship and somehow giving her something back. I don't really buy that, and I think that it is much more than a letter. But I think the formal point of something that hasn't arrived yet, that is absolutely full of potentiality, is the key thing to hold on to.
Adam, I was intrigued by the number of references, and you drew these out extremely well in your paper, the number of references to the physicality in play, in these emotional and psychological processes. I mean, at the top of the second side, El état tout physique, you underline the quotation 3 lines from the bottom, nous suons morts et passions, the body, the bousculé, the meurtre, the meurtri. I'm not arriving at formulating a question here, but I just thought it connected in very strong ways with the kinds of things that were said this morning when Anne did the presentation for the seminar.
Yeah, I quite agree. And it's something that is quite a big part of, and this kind of crashing self-reference, but it's a big part of what I say in my book about reading, which is that it's not just a mental activity, it's absolutely embodied. And the interconnection of the senses and the mind is absolutely, we can't take those things apart. And I think a natural development of that line of thinking is to go to Merleau-Ponty and to others to develop it. And I think there are others in a much better position than me to do that, like Anne, par exemple.
Merci. Oui, alors c'est formidable de vous avoir entendu tous les deux, comme le disait Michael, l'un après l'autre, parce que tu viens de parler d'embodiment. Il y a vraiment chez Proust une incarnation du verbe, mais alors pas chrétienne, mais une incarnation du verbe oral, comme tu as pu le montrer, et comme on peut aussi y penser quand le nom de la personne aimée passe par la bouche quand on le prononce dans les jeunes filles. Et puis une incarnation de l'écriture, évidemment, qui fait qu'il y a une espèce d'impact émotionnel et charnel indéfectiblement qui se produit. Voilà, donc c'était juste pour marquer effectivement cette importance charnelle du langage chez Proust.
J'avais une petite question un peu naïve, mais I had a question. I was intrigued listening to you by two kinds of difference, really. One, the difference between letters that are, or missives that are quoted directly, as opposed to being not quoted and reconstructed through, I received a message and I felt this, that, and the other. And I just wonder if you... And then the other distinction would be in terms of temporality. I wonder whether... It seems to me that these scenes of letter reception, are they... presumably they're not impervious to the attacks or to the processes of time, and yet they don't seem to be part and parcel of events that have been sort of covered over by other. They seem to be very, and that's partly why this embodiment seems to me to be so marked, that they are still cuisants in the memory. They are there as they are relived. They're relived, en direct, as it were, rather than being sort of mediated by.
Absolutely. But what they also do is to modify and change the event, the earlier events to which they refer, which amplifies how cuisant they are in the present moment. So the suffering or the pleasure that a given missive has the potential to create is all the greater because of the things that the mind does with it before it's even arrived. Yeah.
It was very interesting this morning when Jean-Yves Tadier made a very important point when he said that à la recherche, it's not a pornographic novel. Yeah, and I found it interesting the way in which the representation of eroticism is presented, because it's as though while here we talk about the letter, having its physicality, the actual physicality in lovemaking is actually not much in evidence. Do you know that you're sort of coming? Many of the scenes involving Albertine with Marcel, it's really the word. That c'est tout à fait c'est la parole, c'est peut-être l'érotisation de la parole, mais dans un autre sens, le corps est absent presque. N'est-ce pas que la deuxième partie du roman est peut-être dominée par l'amour, c'est le cycle Albertine, n'est-ce pas? Mais c'est au niveau du langage, de la... Voilà. Et cet échange de signes entre amants, mais là je complique un peu les choses en disant cela.
Mais il se peut que ça commence avec François Le Champy, parce que c'est la maman qui saute les scènes de l'amour. Donc, oui. Alors il y a la parole, mais pas la...
Oui, tout à fait.
Le côté corporel, c'est le côté corporel qui manque.
Tout à fait. Oui.
Albertine's joues roses were a bit like the body coming back. I always thought that the repetition of the joues roses, these pink cheeks that Albertine has, that always felt to me like the body coming back, despite one's attempts to jump over it. But
J'étais frappée dans le texte, la citation 7, oh, je l'ai perdu. Dans les lettres de l'algèbre, il ne reste plus la détermination des chiffres de l'arithmétique, lesquels déjà ne contiennent plus les qualités des fruits ou des fleurs additionnées. Déjà, parler des lettres de l'algèbre, qui reprendre le mot de lettres, et l'algèbre qui est la pure symbolisation, mais qui est complètement vide de qualité de vie, vraiment. Ça me frappe comme... Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres allusions à justement l'algèbre ou les mathématiques, qui est un langage à l'état pur, en un sens?
Oui, il y a un moment, je crois que c'est dans le côté des gars, non, sur Des Mégamorts, il y a une scène avec Monsieur de Charlus qui est en train de draguer un jeune homme, effectivement. Là, il parle, c'est le marquis de Surgy qui est là, et les échanges entre les deux hommes sont décrits en termes d'équation, de l'algèbre. Voilà. Alors, oui, c'est intéressant ça. À part ça, je ne sais pas.